Yes, you read that right. It's time. It's finally time. Or honestly, you could just jump into Excel and Google Docs. That's fine too. Hello everyone, I'm Deanna and I'm trying to scribble my way to becoming a traditionally published author. In this video, we're going to go over the easiest and most reliable plot structures, character archetypes, and tips for building your setting in a way that doesn't bog you down or prevent you from writing your first draft. Before we start, just the usual reminder that if you're interested in learning more about me or what I'm currently writing, please do check out my channel. There's plenty of videos for you to catch up on there. Also, just to point out that this video is weeks 3 and 4 of my How to Write a Book for Beginners in the year. And if you want to follow my suggested timings and you haven't seen the other videos, you should go back and start at the beginning. That means there will also be no new video for the series on Monday next week because this video covers 2 weeks in a row, but I will have something else up that will hopefully be fun. And I know even 2 weeks might not seem like enough time to plan your novel, but honestly, this is just trying to get you as close to getting pen to paper as possible and actually starting the draft as fast as you can. Remember, a book doesn't just take one draft, so you're going to be going back and forth in the future anyway, and having every single detail planned out, while beneficial to some writers, might be a detriment to you. I promise that whatever plans you come up with will almost inevitably change when you actually start writing as well. So if it's your first time writing a novel, it's usually better to just set yourself a time limit for the planning and get stuck in. Of course, though, these videos also work as a standalone, so if you're just here to plan your novel from start to finish, you're in the right place. Also, final reminder / disclaimer, these videos are geared primarily towards beginners, but as always, I'll be sprinkling in tips for more advanced writers and writers who want to look at publishing in the future. Alright, let's get going. We have a lot to cover. So first I wanted to explain quickly how this video is structured. Obviously it's quite difficult to make a video that will cover the needs of every single author for every single genre and novel. But the way I thought would make the most sense to do this is to make it a kind of choose your own adventure. So after the introduction here, where we'll decide your most basic metadata for your novel, there are 3 parts to the video: how to plan your plot, how to plan your characters, and how to plan your setting and world building, which also includes the time period that you're writing in. So let's just get stuck straight into what I mean by metadata. When I say metadata, I mean the most basic parts of your novel planning. So that is your theme, your tense, your person, your point of view character, your timeline, and your tone. And if those terms or some of them don't mean anything to you, then don't worry, we're going to go over all of them. As with most things when writing a novel, a lot of these are heavily dependent on your genre, and also dependent, of course, on the type of story that you want to write. But we're going to start with what I'd call the keystone of planning, and which is pretty tied into your pitch and your general novel idea, which we covered in the first video, and that is your theme. The theme of a piece of writing or art is basically the message that it's trying to convey. We discussed a little bit about theme in the first video of this series, where we basically reverse engineered Cinderella and worked out that the theme is the universe rewards the good and punishes the wicked. Now, your pitch or novel idea might already have a theme that is emergent or obvious, or you might already know the theme without having to write it down, but now is the time to actually write it down. And if you don't have one, to decide on one. Bear in mind, obviously, the theme doesn't have to be high-handed or have a moral judgment to it. So let's say your story is about a ragtag team of space adventurers who discover a lost treasure, sell it off, and live happily ever after off of that money. The theme of that story might be as simple as, wow, the world is full of wonder and we should appreciate every moment of our lives. In that case, you're probably writing an action or adventure kind of novel. Or your theme might be that the colonialist appropriation of artifacts is a blight on our collective morality, and anyone who participates in it is perpetuating the continued oppression of colonized cultures and countries. Hopefully that illustrates pretty handily how having the same plot with 2 different themes can change the meaning of a story and the tone of it, obviously, completely. That's why it's important to have at least a broad sense of your theme as early as possible. It will, and in fact should, affect almost every part of your storytelling and planning as well. Saying that, as always, don't worry if you can't nail down your theme completely right now. To tell the truth, to me, and I'm sure to a lot of other writers as well, the theme kind of emerges as you start writing, sometimes halfway through a novel, sometimes earlier, sometimes later, but it comes out more in the process a lot of the time, because that's when you start to see the bigger picture of the work, the parts that you've kind of put in more subconsciously, and you can also grasp the new ideas that come in during writing that are maybe more interesting to you than even the ideas you came up with during the planning stage. But at this point, even having a sense of whether the story will have have a happy, sad, or bittersweet ending, for instance, can really make a difference for you. Or you can decide on a very simple, ubiquitous theme like love conquers all, just to serve as like a kind of general direction at this point in your planning stage. I'm also going to take for granted that you've already done this, but just in case you haven't, do also take a moment to make sure you've nailed down the genre of your novel. Your story doesn't have to fit perfectly into every convention, but most genres are broad enough to allow quite a lot of variety and breathing room, so there should be at least some representation or a niche for a novel like yours. If you feel like your novel is really like mixed between different genres, just pick the most dominant one, or the one you think it most likely is, or the one it's most similar to. This is important because your genre is going to help you decide a lot of the things on this list for you, or is going to at least nudge you in the right direction that will make the most sense for the kind of story you want to tell. So, with that being said, let's go down the list. So first, tense. Your tense is maybe obviously the tense that your actual writing will be in when you write the novel. Most novels are written in the past tense, so she walked, she said, but some are written in the present, she walks, she says. And the latter is usually used if the genre that you're writing in, see, genre is important, requires a lot of immediacy or has a lot of action. So, action novels, obviously, but then also a lot of YA or young adult can be written like this. And also sometimes thrillers or contemporary fiction. As with anything in writing, you can play around with this a lot and be as experimental as you want. So, nothing is stopping you from writing a novel completely in future tense. But realistically, for your first time, if you've never written a novel before, you probably want to pick one of the easier ones just to get a feel for what it actually is to write a book. Basically, just think about whether your novel would benefit more from introspection or immediacy and pick past or present based off of that. Next, let's look at your person and point of view character, which I wanted to take together even though they're actually two slightly different things. Your person refers to, confusingly, the point of view that the novel is actually told in, whether it's I said, you said, or he, she, they said. The point of view character, on the other hand, is the actual character who we see the events of the story from, like whose eyes we look through. So it's probably easier or better to decide the latter first. Decide which of your characters, whether one or multiple, we are actually going to be following along with and looking at the world through. Obviously, the protagonist or the main character is usually a popular choice for this, but you can also have an ensemble cast where we jump into the points of view or the shoes of different characters to see the story from their perspective between different chapters. So the most common setups for this are seeing the story just through the main character's eyes, seeing it from the points of view of two sides of a romance or a relationship. This is obviously usually used in romance novels, but it can be used in other types of novels as well. And the third type, which is more than two people, and it's an ensemble cast where the plot is maybe a bit more complicated. You're going between different characters, seeing the plot from their perspective and what they're doing to contribute to it. That's obviously the most complicated one. We have to juggle multiple points of view, multiple narrative threads. So if you want to try that one, try and keep the number of characters that you're using as low as you can, at least until you gain the skills to be able to do this with more people. I know we all want to be George R. R. Martin, but writing like that is really hard and time-consuming if you're a beginner, so just watch out for that. Once you know which characters you're going to be looking through for the duration of your novel, you can decide what person you're going to be writing in. So, first person is when the narrative is communicated directly through that character's experiences. So the narrative will say, I saw, I walked, I did something. This has a similar effect to writing in the present tense. It's more immediate and urgent, and therefore it's used for similar genres to the present tense. So again, thrillers, YA, action, and contemporary are the most common ones for this. You get a more vivid read on a character's thoughts and feelings, which can heighten whatever's happening. But it does mean that you're limited to only describing what that one character sees, experiences, feels, says, thinks, etc. in that moment, or what they directly witness someone else doing. So you can't describe how another character in the scene is feeling. You would have to just say what your point of view character sees and what they infer that character is feeling from what they see, if that makes sense. Next is second person. Second person is probably used the least commonly, and I think you can probably see why. It is basically saying, you saw, you walked, you did something. It's sometimes also called epistolary because it is almost like reading a letter that someone's addressed to you, and the you can vary from being another character or actually the reader if the novel is going to be meta about it. I would say this is definitely the hardest point of view to write well. You have to be quite clear about your intentions with it and your application of it, so it can be quite hard for beginners to grasp. So even though it might seem cool and interesting and tempting because it's like one of the least used and you want to be original, again, really think hard about whether you're going to be able to pull that off in your first draft. And if you are dead set on using it, I would say maybe try writing the story first in one of the other points of view, and then once you've really ironed out all the plot problems that inevitably arise with all of us when we write our first draft, then turn it into second point of view in one of the later drafts down the line. Lastly, there's third person, which is she saw, she walked, she did something, or he or they or whatever pronouns you want to use. Obviously, this mode of writing is very versatile and can also be broken down into third person omniscient or third person limited. Third person omniscient is kind of like the story is being told by God, someone who sees everything. So they know and can tell the reader what every single character feels, knows, is doing, etc. in any given scene without worrying about what's known as head hopping, which is when the narrative describes something that the character from whose point of view you're writing shouldn't know. Third person limited, on the other hand, is the opposite of that. It's kind of almost like writing in first person but still using he, she, they pronouns. So we're still anchored to one character and only what they know and they think and they see, but we're just slightly pulled out if you imagine it to be like a camera instead of when you're using first person and using I, when it's almost like you're in their head. By the way, third person is also the person that you want to write in if you have a narrator outside of your point of view character. So if you have someone telling the story that also has their own opinions aside from the opinions and views of the character whose head you're in. As always, if any of this has sounded confusing, the best way to kind of understand it is probably to just go and read books that are told in these various people, modes of narration, and just seeing how they do it and how that works for them. Speaking of which, I know when I was starting out, I definitely struggled a lot with head hopping. So if you're worried about that and you kind of just want to be able to write everything that's happening in a scene, just start off with third person omniscient, because I think that's like the easiest entry level point really, and like the easiest way of writing where you don't have to worry about like what does your character know in that moment, whose point of view you're writing from. It's just a little bit more forgiving in that front. So next is timeline, which is a pretty brief one and isn't going to be relevant to everyone. This is basically just deciding if what you're going to be writing is going to be presented to the reader in a linear way compared to the in-universe timeline of events. So this is only relevant in a few cases I can think off the top of my head. If you're telling a time traveling story, well, first of all, you're braver than me. But secondly, obviously, you want to know the timeline of when you're going to be revealing the events to the reader versus the timeline of the events within the history of the novel. And the same goes for if you're telling like a dual timeline story where one story echoes the other one. This is really common in like family sagas. So like, a grandmother discovering a secret at the same time as her granddaughter discovering it, in the sense of the same time being, for the reader, it's happening at the same time, but obviously they're, like decades apart. This is also true if you're presenting things out of order to the reader in order to conceal information. So this might happen in like a thriller or a murder mystery where you have the murder scene come up much later in the book, even though it happened much earlier, so that the reader can catch up on your reveal like at an appropriate time in the narrative, but out of order compared to the actual events in the timeline in the novel. I'm not suggesting that you just nail down your timeline magically right now, by the way. It will probably take you longer and will mean that you have to actually write out the plot. But at this point, just decide whether you're going to need to think about that in the future or whether you're going to present things just sequentially as they happen in the in-universe timeline. Final bit for the metadata section is your tone. And I would say your tone is a bit difficult to change if you're a complete beginner in writing. It usually takes a little bit of experience, but I thought it was worth mentioning anyway. And that's because in order to change the tone or the mood you create with your writing, you need to be aware of your writing voice first. And the voice is difficult to define as well because it's basically just what makes your writing yours. So it's your word choices, the kind of things you choose to focus on your descriptions, your vocabulary, the writing techniques you use. It's basically every aspect of your writing that would differentiate your writing from someone else's. And in order to have a voice or find your voice, you already need to have done an amount of writing until you can kind of notice what your patterns are, what you prefer to highlight versus what you prefer to hide when you're writing. And your strengths strengths and weaknesses, and then that's when you can kind of start to build out what makes your writing yours and what makes your voice individual. And after you're aware of that is when you can start to vary your voice from scene to scene, indeed. And that's a bit easier, I would argue, but varying it from book to book is a little bit harder because you need kind of a level of consistency and awareness that might be difficult. But it's still worth trying. What you should do for this is think of the dominant kind of mood or atmosphere that you want to create in the novel, or emotion works for this as well. Do you want your reader to feel angry and perturbed, sad, happy and playful? Obviously, you're going to want them to feel a range of emotions depending on what's happening on the scene, but what's kind of the overall keynote emotion or sense that you want them to come away with? So you can decide on that and use that as a way to guide your writing process as well. So now it's time to go into the other sections of planning where the real work begins. Every genre and every novel is going to need a different emphasis on these 3 kind of key pillars of planning and a different order for planning them in. This is because obviously you're going to have one of these sections more fleshed out in your head already, and also your story is going to be inherently more focused on one of these areas. In fact, this is even dependent on the type of idea or pitch you have. So for instance, if you have a novel that's about a single mother going on a fantasy adventure, you probably know more about the character than you do about the quest they're going on, so the plot. On the other hand, if you know your story is about a war over the stealing of an elven artifact, you probably know more about your setting than you do about some of the other things going on. So the next decision that you're going to have to make in your planning process is which of these 3 things, plot, character, and setting, are the most important in your novel. Also keeping in mind that depending on your genre, the setting also includes your world building section. If you can, take a moment to list them out for yourself in order of importance, and then also think about which of the 3 you actually have the most ideas about already. It's possible that those 2 things will coincide, but you might as well figure it out now if they don't, because that would be useful to you in answering this next question. Do you want to solidify the things you already know the most about, or do you want to venture into unknown territory and have a blank slate in one of the other sections where you can use your existing ideas as scaffolding to create something totally new? Basically, the choice boils down to whether you want to slowly ease yourself into the planning process by really nailing down the basics and getting down what you already know, or if you're feeling extra creative and just want to play on a blank canvas, throw things at a wall and see what sticks, and use your pre-existing ideas more as like a base for your new ones. If you're in doubt or if this decision is giving you analysis paralysis, honestly, just go for the path of least resistance and do the easiest thing, which in this case is probably just covering what you already know the most about or have the most ideas with, and just go to that section. Wherever you decide to go, I'll see you there. So personally, I always start with the plot of a novel myself. This is both because I write fantasy, but also because I like to kind of come up with the situation first and then decide what kinds of people I'd like to put into that situation afterwards, like who would be the most fun to throw in there, because I'm evil, I guess. So for this section, we are going to look at 3 plot structures that I think are like the most beginner friendly: the 8-point structure, the 3-arc structure, and Save the Cat, which you've probably heard of. It's pretty famous. Obviously, some genres have more detailed structures that can be used, like the hero's journey, which is used for fantasy and everything. And also Romancing the Beat, which can be used as a romance plot structure. But like I said, today I just want to focus on these 3, which I think are kind of the most basic and universally useful. We're also not going to be touching the snowflake method, even though I do think it has its merits. I fear that it might slow some people down quite a lot, and it's also, I think, more useful for filling in the gaps in a plot rather than necessarily coming up with a plot from the beginning. But who knows, maybe I'll make an extra video on that if people are interested later down the line. Now, the key to planning your plot is basically going to be taking these plot structures and slotting in a sentence or 2 into each of the beats or the points along the line in each of the structures that we go over. Just pick whichever structure seems easiest, or use my combined structure at the end that includes all of them together in an unholy amalgamation. Anyway, I think it'll be easier to understand once you see an example, but first let's just quickly cover what a plot structure actually is. A plot structure is basically a line or a shape that maps out the events of a story, often graphing it out to show the moments of highest and lowest intensity or action. And action doesn't mean exploding cars necessarily, it just means the highest level of activity or tension in the plot. Most plot structures have the action ramping up until you reach the climax of the story where the biggest, flashiest, most emotional thing happens, and then the action ramps down to wrap up the plot. So I'm going to start with an 8-point structure here because I think it's the simplest, honestly, even though it's the least well known. And it's also the one I first used when I started writing, so I thought I should give it pride of place here. And this plot structure comes from the book How to Write a Novel and Get It Published by Nigel Watts. So the stages of this 8-point structure are stasis, trigger, quest, surprise, critical choice, climax, reversal, and resolution. So we're going to go over these in more detail, and then we're going to see how they map onto the other plot structures, because honestly they're very similar, but I think each stage that we're going to go through just adds a little bit more detail for you to kind of fill in as we go through each one. The stasis refers to where your characters are living in their status quo, or what is normal day-to-day life for them. This is where we're introduced to the main character or the first character in the cast, their desire or their problem, and the setting. So obviously this includes the stakes. The novels that want us to really empathize with a character the most will stress this section quite heavily. So, that's probably romance novels, maybe YA or contemporary, whereas novels where the plot is kind of the point sometimes skip this section entirely and go straight to the trigger. But basically this is, Frodo in the Shire, the Little Mermaid in the sea, everything is normal for that character. Keeping in mind, of course, that normal for that character might be very abnormal for our world and for the reader, but the key is it's normal for them, not for us. Next is the trigger, which is also sometimes called the thing that changes everything. This is where the adventure starts and things change for your character, where the plot really gets going. Now we're going to be using the Hunger Games as an example throughout this because honestly, I just rewatched the movie. So, in the Hunger Games, the stasis is that Katniss is living in District 12 in poverty, hunting squirrels to survive and to provide for her family. And that is until the trigger happens, which is Prim getting chosen for the Hunger Games and Katniss volunteering as tribute in her place. Now, what's important here is that even though the trigger might come as an external event, your character or characters have to choose to respond to it and choose to actually participate in the plot. They don't have to be happy to answer this call to adventure. I mean, Katniss was terrified. But if you're thinking of publication, if you're thinking of having readers, or even if you just straight up want to craft a novel or story for the first time that follows like the advised expected conventions, and that makes your reader respect and like your characters, you really want them to be active in this case and to make a choice to actually follow the plot. And I get the instinct to be like, well, that's what everyone's doing and that's boring and I want to be original, so I'm going to have a passive character. But I promise you there's a reason there's not that many passive characters, and that's because they're really hard to write in a way that makes them still likable and compelling. The usual advice, unfortunately, is true. Before you break the rules, you should know why the rules are in place. So if this is your first novel, just try writing it according to these conventions, and then next time you'll be better able to see how you can break them in a way that is successful and works. To go back to my craftsman analogy from a previous video, try and make a table with 4 legs that stands up straight before you try an avant-garde table, right? Like, we all have to start somewhere. So next is the quest, which is fairly self-explanatory, but this is also sometimes called the fun and game section or the promise of the premise. This is the part of the novel where the character enters a strange new world, obviously not necessarily literally, but it's a different circumstance to what they were in before, and you deliver to the reader whatever it is you promised in the pitch. So in the Hunger Games, this is the depravity and the opulence of the capital, the preparations and training montages, and really the games themselves too can fall under this category. For a fantasy adventure novel, maybe this is the first monster fights. For a police procedural or a thriller, maybe this is where, after the initial murder that serves as the trigger, there's a first break in the case. Whatever your book would say on the blurb, this is the section to really get into it, where your character gains their first wins and maybe even start to have fun in the situation. Saying that, the character's actions and attitude during this period usually depends on whether their trigger event was positive or negative. Obviously, if it's negative, they're trying to escape and return to the status quo. And if it's positive, they're trying to keep the situation going longer or to even remain in it indefinitely. Next is the surprise section, or which might be better called the surprises section. The number and type depends on the genre and the kind of story you're telling, but if in doubt, just do 3 and have them ramp up in action each time. This will take up part of the middle of your novel, and honestly, I think the 8-point structure suffers in this regard in that it doesn't cover it in as much detail as I would like, because I actually think the middle of the novel can be one of the most challenging bits to write. I mean, it definitely is for me, and I've heard other writers say the same. But in essence, this is when the protagonist is tested by the new world, with each challenge putting them in a worse and worse position until it culminates in the biggest surprise in the middle of the book, which recontextualizes everything that's come before. And it usually also marks the point where the protagonist goes from being passive and just reacting to the world to being active and actually changing it. Kind of the equivalent of going from being on the defensive to being on the attack, I guess. So again, if you need an example, in the Hunger Games, this is Katniss teaming up with Rue and actually starting to make plans and attack people instead of hiding in trees and kind of trying to keep her head down in the games. Also, that last surprise should trigger a kind of cascade effect in your plot, from which the events should inevitably flow and lead to your climax towards the end of the novel. But of course, before that, you have your critical choice. This is where the protagonist, just like with the trigger point, chooses to engage with the climax. Usually this is choosing a course of action by making a plan or making a decision. And as with all of these points, there can be different amounts of time or other plot elements in between the two sections. So like in the Hunger Games, I would argue that the critical choice is Katniss deciding that she'd rather die than follow the Capitol's bullshit anymore, and therefore her and Peter should eat the deadly berries. And at the same time, that is also the climax or the highest emotional point in the novel. Following also some of the highest action points where, you know, they attack Cato together and things like that. The other stories, though, the critical choice might be to like infiltrate an enemy base, and then you expect to have a few scenes of the planning process and getting the team together before you actually get to the climax, which is the infiltration itself. And with that, hopefully you also understand the next point, which is the climax. This is when the critical choice is realized and the protagonist basically finds out whether they chose right or wrong, using the highest action and tension your plot and your genre can provide. It can be as small as an argument or as large as an intergalactic war, but this is the part where readers should be on the edge of their seats. After that comes the reversal, also sometimes known as falling action, because we've now reached the peak and we're now sliding down. This is where the tension is released and we see the cascading consequences of the climax. The key, and the reason it's called the reversal, is because it should include the reversal of the state of something or someone in your plot or in your world. So for instance, a building goes from existing to being destroyed. A character goes from alive to dead. A government goes from being in charge to being deposed. This is where the tide turns for good or for bad, and your character's world is changed forever, big or small. And that's when you come to the end of the story, the resolution, or in essence, a new status quo or new normal. The story is finished and the characters have come out the other side, also changed by the events of the plot. So in the Hunger Games, this is Katniss winning and becoming materially much better off, but also being scarred and changed by the events of the novel, and also knowing that there's probably more problems with the Capitol looming on the horizon. And that's the most basic structure for a ubiquitous kind of, I guess, Western-centric story plot. Obviously, there's other plot structures that other time periods and cultures use, but this is like the one that we see the most in media, is probably the most accepted and like the most, I don't know, I guess recognizable to most audiences at this point. So this won't take nearly as long, but let's go over how the other two structures, the 3-act structure and Save the Cat, kind of layer on and are similar to the structure, but add a little bit more detail in case you need it. So 3-act structure, for instance, also starts with a stasis, but the emphasis in the structure is making sure you get your character, your goal, and your stakes, which I mentioned before, but it is very useful to keep in mind. I would say some of the most successful novels have all of this on the first page, but I mean, common wisdom is you need to have it at least in your first chapter. Then the 3-act structure calls the trigger the inciting incident, but the principle is similar, and then follows this up with the decision, which we already talked about, is basically the character or characters deciding to actually engage with the trigger and be part of the plot. That is where the first act ends, otherwise known as the break into 2, and it's basically the first of 3 climaxes throughout the plot, if you want to look at it that way. The quest in this version of a plot structure is called The Promise of the Premise, which I already mentioned. And during this, the 3-act structure emphasizes there should be continued rising action and a pinch point. A pinch point is kind of like a mini climax, or where your character is literally in a pinch. So closed in by enemies, otherwise put in a tight spot which they manage to get out of. After this pinch point, you have the surprise, which in this structure is called the midpoint, marking the halfway point of the novel. The midpoint turn is where everything changes, and this is considered the end of the second act or the second of the 3 climaxes. Then you get another bigger, more painful pinch point right after. So again, in the Hunger Games, this will be Rue dying. This is kind of the moment where things get about as bad as they get for your character, sometimes causing them to lose heart for a little bit. At this point, it's slightly confusing because the 3-act structure calls the critical choice the reversal, which has a different meaning in the other structure, but the principle is the same. For one of the darkest moments in the plot, the characters instead decide to rise up to the occasion and meet the climax head on. This is then followed by the denouement, which is the same as the reversal in the 8-point structure, and the resolution in this structure is called the finale. So hopefully you can see how they're very similar, but the 3-act structure is kind of more detailed, and the same can be said for Save the Cat. So Save the Cat structure is named after the very famous writing book by the same name, which I honestly recommend to every writer, and I think every writer has recommended it to every other writer, but seriously, it's worth it. But in case you just want like the little nutshell version, here it is. In Save the Cat, the stasis is broken down into the opening image, the setup, and stating the theme of the story. So metaphorically or symbolically signaling from the outset the meaning of what the reader is about to kind of see happen in the plot. The trigger is then called the catalyst, which is the same, followed by the debate, which is where before making the decision to actually follow the call to adventure, the character thinks about it and debates on it, which I think is also a useful thing to add in. And then you still have the decision where the call to adventure is answered affirmatively. This is followed by a lot of stuff we already covered. So we have the fun and games, the midpoint, the pinch point, and then something slightly new as a concept, but we kind of did touch on, which is the dark night of the soul and all is lost. So these sections are kind of what I talked about earlier. They emphasize a moment in which the character or characters have their darkest moment before they rally in time for the climax, taking a moment where they feel like they've already lost and turning it into instead making a decision or a plan to go through to the end of the novel. The structure rounds out the story with the finale, which is the same as the climax, and then the final image. So hopefully looking at that, you can kind of decide which structure you want to use. But personally, I use them all in this unholy amalgamation. I think all the structures have their own strengths and weaknesses, so I think it's a pretty good idea to combine the parts that you like and you think are important to make sure that you cover each kind of step in the plotting process. So theoretically, you should just be able to slot in events that logically make sense and follow one from the other into these plot structures to create your own plot. The kind of causality of events in this case is especially important towards the end because the climax and the results of that heavily rely on your character making decisions and then seeing the consequences of the decision play out in full. If you're struggling to plot your novel right now, however, do remember that this video has other sections that might be able to help you out. How can you decide what your character would do if you don't know who they are yet? How can you decide what problems the characters will face if you don't know what the setting is yet? So with that, let's move on to a different section. So to tell you the truth, I'm personally definitely more of a plot first kind of writer, but if you're character first, or at least you're writing a genre that is character first, or this is just a section you wanted to try out, let's get into some techniques for how to come up with characters for your novel. Starting with the easiest way of looking at characters, which is character archetypes. These are useful for looking at characters not as people, but as functions in a plot. i.e. what sort of person would do the things that I need them to do. But even if you're writing in a genre where you want the characters to be more realistic and more like people, archetypes can still be useful because after all, they are still kind of based on types of people as well, and they can even be helpful as a starting point for developing your theme and your setting as well, or even subverting readers' expectations. So there are lots of possible ways to break down the archetypes, but I'll be using the 12 suggested on the Jericho Writers website, which I'll link down below, just because I think they're the most straightforward. As we go through them, think about whether the archetype we're talking about would fit in as your main character, or the hero of your story, and if they don't, think about what other type of character or relation they could have in your plot, whether that's the character's best friend, the character's enemy, the love interest, the parent, or break it down by ally, enemy, and neutral party. That can also be a useful way of looking at it. Each of these archetypes is of course defined by the most important thing that every character has, which is what do they want? So let's get into them. Archetype 1 is the ruler. The ruler is obsessed with power. getting or keeping it. This is a common choice for an antagonist, but can also make a good protagonist. So for instance, the Jericho Writers website says that an example of a protagonist with this archetype would be Walter White from Breaking Bad. And it's good to highlight that, like with all of these, think about where this archetype would fit in for your story and how that will change the kind of story you're telling. The ruler's strengths are their access to resources or their charisma, whereas their weaknesses might be their paranoia or their obsession with staying on top. You can also play around with the strengths and weaknesses of these archetypes, depending on the setting and the character's role in your story. As you might expect, the ruler's main desire is to gain or hold on to power because they're the best person for the job or because they want to use that power for other more nefarious means. Archetype 2 is the creator or the artist. And honestly, I'd be tempted to break these two up, but I can kind of understand why they've been put together here. Basically, it's a person who is or wants to be the best in their chosen discipline. So a brilliant scientist or a visionary artist fall under this category, and their strength is in their determination, their skill in their chosen area, and their intellect and originality, whereas their weaknesses can be things like egotism, perfectionism, or their willingness to bend morality in order to be the best or achieve some height in their discipline, sometimes at the cost of other people or their own morality. The third archetype is the sage. The sage most often ends up being kind of like the mentor figure for the main character because their function is to be a font of knowledge and wisdom, often adding context to the setting or the world. This is their strength, whereas their weakness might be unwillingness to act, from being too cautious or not acknowledging the strengths and the knowledge of others because they're too caught up in what they know. They can be defined by their desire for more knowledge or alternatively for peace and balance. The fourth archetype is the innocent. This role is most often fulfilled by children and animals, as this is a character who has not yet been ruined and brought low morally by the nefarious world. Their strengths lie in their optimism and their belief in the best in people, which can win a lot of protectors to their side. But on the flip side, of course, this makes them vulnerable to deception, and the fact that they lack the skills to protect themselves means that they can be a liability to other characters around them. They mostly want peace and love and what's best for everyone, not realizing that the real world might be a lot more complicated than they think. The fifth archetype is the explorer, which is kind of similar to the artist or the creator, but is more set to exploring a setting or the world around them than a discipline necessarily. Their strength is their innate curiosity and their ability to take events as they come, but they can also be flighty and unreliable or aimless. And they are defined by their desire for novelty or action. Archetype 6 is the rebel. The rebel is convinced that the status quo is wrong, and they either want to break its rules or break down the whole system altogether. Their strength is in their determination and conviction. They might have an ends justifies the means kind of mentality that makes them lose sight of the consequences of their actions, or they might simply be self-righteous and self-centered. And they are defined by their desire for change. The seventh archetype is the most common for a protagonist and is simply known as the hero. The hero is a doer who tries to make the best moral choices they have with the information they have, sometimes at great cost or sacrifice to themselves. They are defined by their desire to make things right, whatever that means for them. Their strengths are their literal physical and mental strength, their conviction, and their bravery. But their weakness is that they can be completely blind to when their morals go awry because they're so used to being in the right that they become overconfident. Despite this being one of the most recognized archetypes for protagonists, by the way, I think it's important to remember that it's really easy to also subvert these archetypes. So for instance, think about how in the TV show and comic book The Boys, Homelander is basically a hero archetype who is actually a villain because he's a caricature of Superman who believes with complete conviction that his truly repugnant morals are right and he will do whatever he can with the strength he has to make them a reality in the world. So even a hero archetype can play a villain role in your story. Archetype 8 is the magician or wizard, who's kind of similar to the sage and also the artist or creator. These characters have a secret or ancient knowledge that others don't have, which is what differentiates them from like the general wisdom of the sage, for instance. Their great strength is having solutions to problems and knowledge that many can't access. But they're also prone to arrogance and their abilities can have unintended consequences, especially since a lot of them typically can't fully control the magic or powers that they have. They might also be corrupted by the power, similar to the ruler archetype. They are defined by their desire to know and control the secrets of the universe, even when it's not necessarily their place to do so. Archetype 9, we're almost there, is the jester or the trickster, otherwise known as the comic relief. In general, they provide levity and humor both for the other characters in the story and the reader by being spontaneous and sharp-witted. They are usually defined by a desire to not take things too seriously and to just live to see another day. Their strength is in being able to offer deeper insight with their jokes, but they can also be superficial, annoying, or empty. The 10th type is the everyman, which is also another really popular archetype for a protagonist. The everyman, or I guess every person, is made to be as generic as possible and therefore as relatable as possible to the reader. They fit in easily and can be a really good glue to hold other more wacky characters together in a group, and they are defined by their desire for things to just be normal or to go back to how they used to be, or the status quo. They're pragmatic and easy to like because they're inoffensive, but their inoffensiveness can also be boring, and their lack of conviction can lead them to very dark paths if they don't say no to certain situations and people. The 11th archetype is the lover, whose main desire is, of course, to obtain or to keep love, similar to the ruler with power, actually. This is an obvious archetype to have in something like a romance novel. Lover archetype characters are passionate and devoted and can be motivated to do great things for their love, but the downside is, of course, that great things can also be terrible things. And if they have no limits on their devotion, they might be led to do something truly terrible. And finally, the 12th and final archetype we're looking at today is the caregiver, or what used to be called the mother figure in older examples. They may be a literal parent, but this is also a good archetype for, I guess, a sidekick, because their main drive and desire is to help others. Their selflessness and loyalty is their strength, but they might also suffer from a lack of leadership qualities and drive, letting worse people take control of the situation because they're too afraid to step up. Okay, we did it. So with those archetypes in place and with you kind of picking archetypes that your characters can fit into, you can flesh out additional character details for each of the characters that you've selected by asking yourself the following questions, which I got partially from the Dabble website, which I'll link below, just like all the other resources that I used for this video, and also compiled from my own questions and experiences with creating characters. Question 1. What do they want? You probably have the broad want from the archetype already, but take this opportunity to really nail down what that want is in the context of your novel and plot. Another way to ask this is, what do they think will make them happy? Followed by question 2, what do they actually need, or what will actually make them happy? And the tension between those two will really add flavor to the character. 3, what are they willing to do to get what they want? Otherwise known as, what's their morality? What's their moral code if they have one? Are they a hero that adheres to their version of morality completely? Are they a thief or a scoundrel that still has a moral code? Or are they a villain willing to do anything necessary to get what they want? 4, what are their strengths? Again, this is suggested by the archetype, but just flesh them out here, especially how they relate to your world. 5, what is their flaw? I.e., what is something internal that could prevent them from getting what they want or need? This is similar to 6. What is something external that could stop them from getting what they want or need? So I'd say the difference between these two is kind of like, what is their character flaw versus what is something that could stop them, like, Superman and Kryptonite. Number 7, I think. 7 is what do they fear? So this is usually tied to their flaw or weakness. Number 8, what is their motivation, which is usually fulfilling their want or avoiding their fear. So you can flesh out here what guides their decision making. Number 9, what is something false they believe now that will be disproven by the end of the story? Number 10, what is an event in your character's past that haunts them, which is usually responsible for the false belief they hold? And 11, and now I'm annoyed it's not 12, but anyway, 11, how will their state reverse over the course of the story? So what will be their change, going from cowardly to brave, going from alive to dead, etc. And these are the character basics. To put an arbitrary number on it, challenge yourself to stick to no more than 10 characters at the outset here, especially if this is your first novel. It's entirely possible you'll need more at the end of it, but honestly you can add more characters on the fly if you need to. And maybe even take characters out because you might realize they're not as necessary as you thought. Now, the reason we ask these questions is because you want your character to follow an arc the same way that your plot does, just in a smaller form. And I'll admit it can be hard or overwhelming to plot character arcs for each of your characters at the beginning here. So as we're starting out, maybe just concentrate on your protagonist and antagonist if you have one, or maybe your top 3 kind of main characters, whatever works for you. But with that, yes, let's have a look at what a character arc is and how to make one. So there are 4 main types of arcs: ascending, descending, transformational, and flat. An ascending character arc means that your character improves their circumstances or themselves by the end of the novel. Descending means the opposite. It means they're given to their flaws or they are in a worse position than they started at the end. A transformational arc basically means that they change or they gain new skills, but there's not necessarily a clear upward or downward trajectory. And a flat character arc is when your character actually doesn't change at all, and this is usually used either for protagonists of things like serial novels or for small background characters that really don't get enough time on the page to have an arc. The type of arc that your main character and the characters around them have is usually connected to the theme and tone of your story. So if you have a theme or an idea for a happy ending, you're probably not going to want your main character to have a descending character arc. So think about the interplay between those as you're making these character arcs. A simple character arc structure is very similar to a plot structure. So if you haven't already watched the plot section, it might actually be helpful for you to do so here. But just to quickly go over what the stages of a character arc might look like. So after you've created your character, the first thing you want to do is establish the character's goal. Next, you want to put obstacles in front of them, making it as hard as possible for them to actually reach that goal. And here you want to use their weaknesses, their fears, their flaws, the event from their past, all those things that we came up with. Next, you want them to fail to overcome those things, or to succeed, but only partially, or have a false victory, basically. And then, depending on the genre and length of your story, you want to repeat those steps. Things happen, they fail, or they only succeed partially or falsely, until you get towards or at the actual climax of the novel, where you force your character to confront that false belief that they hold. Then you want to show the outcome of that confrontation and how the character changes as a result, and then finally you establish a new normal for them. So to give you an example, we're going to stick with the Hunger Games as we have been this whole time. Katniss's goal is to win the Hunger Games and go home. She's repeatedly faced with challenges, including people trying to kill her, but also her internal challenge of not being able to trust people because of her circumstances, of course, and also not wanting to fight back against the Capitol because she believes that doing those things will make her life harder and not easier and make her position worse. However, she slowly starts to trust people like Rue, only to have Rue killed. Katniss is changed by this event, but still decides to trust Peter and work together with him so that they can both win the games and also defy the Capitol. Katniss as a character then comes out of the story as a person who knows there are still those she can trust, even in her messed up world, and that she can stand up to the Capitol, while also being traumatized by the things she witnessed and did, and knowing that there are more fights to come in the future, for which she is better prepared now than at the start of the novel. So you can see in this case how there are some differences to the arc, and you can even argue about whether it's technically an ascending arc or just a transformational one, but either way the basic structure remains the same. Okay, now I said I wouldn't do this, but for people who do love questionnaires and character sheets, I guess, I did also come up with a few additional questions for, if you still have a bunch of time left, but you've done all the other planning and you want to just do something fun and flesh out your characters. Or maybe some of these questions will help you nail down something that's actually quite important for your setting. So the questions are, what is your character's social and economic status? How are they perceived by others, both socially and also physically? Are they intimidating? Are they seen as shy? Are they considered attractive, poorly dressed? What religion are they, if any? How intelligent or observant are they? What are 3 common emotions, thoughts, or mental states that this character feels or experiences regularly? What are 3 common physical states or actions that they take? Are they prone to feeling too hot or too cold? Do they grind their teeth? Do they often play with a cherished heirloom like a necklace? And what skills do they have that distinguish them from those around them? Obviously, there are infinite more questions that you can ask. After all, characters are supposed to be representations of people, and people are infinitely multifaceted. But I would urge you to stick with what we've covered here, or at least not get too lost in the weeds, as there are other sections still to cover and other things still to plan. So, setting is actually a huge section, but you might see that we're probably spending the least amount of time on this. And that's because I'm here to tell you that one of the biggest mistakes that writers make is getting stuck world building instead of actually writing the novel. You can't get your setting or your research or your world building perfect in the first draft. Trust me, everyone's tried. That's why we're going to strip back this section as much as possible down to the bare necessities to prevent world building disease from happening to you. So let's get started. First, decide whether time period is relevant to you. If you're a history novel writer, unfortunately, I don't have a lot of first-hand experience to be able to help you with this, because your planning will have to involve a lot more reading and research than some of the other types of genres that people write. And I don't really want to get into how to research things, because then this video will be like 15 hours long and it's already the longest video I've ever made. But what I will do is link some great resources from another author, Chiba, Meredith E. Phillips, who does write historical novels and who has some advice on how she researches and what she does when she's planning a novel. I will say that in a nutshell, what I would expect is that you should pick up some non-fiction books about the time period, reputable ones at that, that detail the sorts of things that are relevant to you. For instance, if you're writing mostly about soldiers in the time period, you might not necessarily need to know a huge amount about ladies' formal wear, but then again, it depends on the story you're writing, right? Each one is individual. And of course, you're going to want to supplement the writing from our time period, looking back on the historical one, with first-hand accounts actually from that time period that you're writing about. So I'd say your course of action should be to put together a loose plot outline for the sort of story you want to write, then spend a few weeks or even a month doing some reading and digging into the kinds of things you want to happen, and then go back to your plot after that and revise it as necessary alongside your characters to make sure that it's historically accurate. However, if time period isn't really relevant to you because you're writing contemporary or something more speculative, let's forge ahead. For researching and deciding on settings for a contemporary novel or a novel set in our world, I think you can probably start with the same course of action that I just outlined for historical if you want. So make a plan, research for a period of time, refine plan, but don't get bogged down in details. But let's get into the questions that you need to ask yourself, whatever genre you're writing, about your setting. So first ask, do you have one general setting, or are you going to be switching between a lot of places? Obviously, a novel that's set in one city and where from scene to scene you're just going from like a bar to an office to a parking lot in that same city is going to be very different and going to need a very different planning treatment from one where you're kind of bouncing all around the world, changing climates, changing countries, whatever it is. Speaking of which country or countries are the characters in, and how does that influence them? Then you should shrink down and say which region of the country or settlement are they in. Specifically, the size of the settlement, I think, makes the biggest difference here. Like a book set in a small town is going to have a very different energy to one set in a city or in the middle of nowhere. Next, ask what is the landscape and weather like, and how does this influence the plot and the characters? And the same thing for the time or times of year that your novel will take place in. And what all these are drilling down into is the most important question about setting, and that is, what is the atmosphere or the tone that your setting is adding or creating to in your novel? So is the setting supposed to create a sense of whimsy and wonder? Is it unsettling or eerie, cheerful and beautiful? And also, how does this work with your theme? Does it clash or does it work in concert? These will create different effects depending on the answers. So I think the above should honestly give you a pretty solid starting point in terms of planning your setting for a first draft. If you want to, you can repeat the process for individual scenes, but I don't think there's necessarily a need to do that now. You can probably wait until you actually are about to write the scene to go through these questions again. As always, it's just important to remember that each setting, whether it's a gas station, a bedroom, or a museum, should serve the tone that you're trying to convey, and if possible, play into the themes of your novel as well. After you've nailed that down, we can zoom out more into world building if this is something that is needed for your novel. Ask yourself if any of the following will impact the plot or the characters in your novel, and work on them accordingly and in proportion to how important they are. So we have politics and religion, societal norms, rules and laws, speech, language and communication styles, flora and fauna, and magic and technology. Chances are some or even all of these are completely irrelevant to your plot. Knowing them would be nice for the sake of flavor, but at this point you probably don't need to know them at all, and could probably make them up in more detail in a later draft. One way to approach this section without getting overwhelmed or becoming a permanent world builder is to look at your characters and your plot and ask yourself, what information do I really need to make the plot work and to make the characters feel grounded? Now, let's go over how you can apply this idea to each of the sections we just listed. So, a big one. If one of your characters is a magic user, obviously you're going to want to set up the basics. And I mean the basics of how your magic system works. This is pretty easy to do. First, just decide whether you want hard or soft magic. So hard magic is a solid system with specific rules, where the point of the magic is to create clever obstacles the characters can then subvert, and the reader might be able to see those subversions coming because the rules are so clear and solid and internally consistent with the logic of the world. Soft magic, on the other hand, is more vibes or like narrative needs based, and is mostly there to instill a sense of wonder both in the characters and the reader. You might liken the difference between the two systems as the difference between a detective novel versus a mystery novel. After that, you should focus on the following very basic questions. I honestly think you don't need much past these for a first draft. Again, it's because it's a first draft, and the last thing I want is for you to be designing a magic system for the next 10 years. Like, there's too many cases. It's an epidemic. So, the questions are, what can magic do? What can't magic do? What is its cost? What is its source? Who can use it or who has it? What do people believe about it? And what is the truth about it? And does anyone know this truth is also an optional concern here. You can use this sparing, limited approach for any details that you want to fill into your setting or your world. So for instance, obviously, if your novel is about the deep religious intricacies and implications of this world, of course, you should spend more time digging into resources online about how to build your own religious system, for instance. But if religion is just flavor in your setting, there's really no need to spend time on that right now. You don't need to name every saint or every step in your religious structure to start writing a first draft. And really, at a certain point, it becomes procrastination. Yes, I see you. I've been there. Don't do it. For now, you just need to know what's on the page. So like, if one of your characters is a priest, maybe it's relevant for you to come up with or decide on what their training and duties entail, but you probably don't need to know the name of the ritual that they're sworn in using, or like the name of every feast day and festival in their religion. Just use your common sense and concentrate on what is actually relevant to the story you want to tell, not the other way around. Just as an example for the other sections. For languages, you want to concentrate on who speaks different languages to each other or has different communication styles, and how this can create a barrier between characters in your plot. For flora and fauna, think about maybe what hazards those things can pose for your characters, or maybe what's valuable or important in a region and what can therefore cause interpersonal or even geopolitical conflicts. Similarly, what political machinations or changes might impact the characters' lives directly during the novel? What social norms might they not meet or fall awry of, and what are the consequences of those wherever they are? Always think of any world building or setting stuff in terms of how it's relevant to the characters and plot of the novel you are writing. And also think about how your plot and characters can impact those things in return too. It's not just a one-way street. So there you have it. That's all the settings, characters, and plots that there are in the world. To be honest, when I first started working on things like plot structures and character archetypes, it felt really depressing to see such a large percentage of the stories that we've told as a species be broken down into like these featureless building blocks. It really made me feel like every story has already been told and I should just give up. But I want you to remember that the magic of stories is in their specificity, in the words used to write them, in the jobs, hobbies, and inside jokes that your characters have, in the details of the places that you come up with or maybe describe from life. The story you're writing has probably been told before, it's true, but it hasn't been told by you. It hasn't been written the way that you would write it. And storytelling is one of our greatest and oldest inventions. It influences how we structure memories. It's one of the keystones of the development of our languages and our civilizations. It allows us to make sense of ourselves and this huge, scary world. So please, if you take away anything from this video, don't deprive yourself of the joy of storytelling just because the story you want to tell has been told before. It has been told before, and it will be told again, but it will only be told by you once in the whole history of the universe. So go out there and tell it. But, you know, maybe do some planning first. I can't believe we got through all that. Oh my god. Thank you so much for your time, and I really hope that you find something useful in at least something I said today. Good luck with your planning over the next 2 weeks, or however long you've decided this needs to take. As always, if you found this video helpful, please do subscribe so you don't miss next week's video where we might, oh my god, start writing the first chapter. Can it be true? I mean, we'll see. No promises, honestly. Also, it won't be next week's video. It'll be 2 weeks from now because this video covers 2 weeks, but I'll have a different video up. Don't worry about it. And if you have any questions or you have any other planning methods that have worked for you in the past or planning methods that absolutely haven't worked, please do comment down below. But as always, thank you so much for watching and I hope I'll see you next time. Bye!